Hello and welcome to Your Coaching Journey, a podcast for doctors about coaching. Whether you're a coaching doctor, a doctor who is learning to coach, or a doctor who'd like to build coaching into your professional life, then this is the podcast for you.
Hi, I'm Helen Leathers, and with me today is my business partner and podcast co-host, Tom Dillon. Good morning, Tom. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yes.
Good.
I am looking forward to our conversation today, as ever. Last time on the podcast, we talked about neuroscience and how certain areas within neuroscience, having an awareness of them would be really useful to us as coaches. And you mentioned about the SCARF model, which has come about as a result of some research. So I thought we could talk about that today.
Let's talk about the SCARF model, which I think is really interesting. It's not specifically neuroscience, but it uses research from neuroscience in a model that is accessible and useful and worth thinking about in the coaching room. So yeah, great topic for conversation.
Okay, so first of all, what would the model be useful for?
I think it comes from the research that it's based on is around social neuroscience. So it's that exploration of what goes on in our brains and our nervous systems when we're engaged in social groups and social interactions with others. So that's the origin of it, and that's why it relates to neuroscience. So work of Matthew Lieberman, Naomi Eisenberger, and a few others all feed into the same research. So the research paper that I think it was for a dissertation, a thesis, I think, for David Rock, who is a leadership consultant and coach, and I think he was doing a doctorate in leadership. So I think this was his thesis.
Okay.
So he is a doctor now. So it's really about how we respond to social interactions, and what he describes as the organising principle of the brain is that we try to minimise the threat responses that we have, and minimise the threat to ourselves, and we maximise the reward response. So that's what we're constantly searching out for reward, and we are trying to minimise the threat. So this, whilst we talk about neuroscience, it's actually some evolutionary science in there as well.
Yeah.
It's going back to our animalistic nature, and we have those drives in us that we are constantly searching for reward, and we're constantly trying to avoid threat.
So if we're with a client, what would we look out for which would tell us this model would be useful?
I think probably the most common way that you would use it is if someone's talking about a threat response. Well, they might not even talk about the fact they're having, but you might well see a threat response in them. So they might start to get agitated when they talk about something, or they'll just talk about a difficult situation, and maybe their reaction to a difficult situation. So you might just recognise that, because you have an awareness of it, that they are in that threat response territory. Yeah. So you might well bring it in at that point.
So it could be a difficult situation with someone at work,
yes,
for example, and they're agitated by that.
Yeah.
Or they're stressed, or maybe even angry by that.
Yeah. So any stress response.
Yeah.
So that's interesting because, and I've actually tweaked the model a little bit.
There's a surprise.
Yeah. So if we go back and kind of look at the model, and we'll post an image of it in the show notes so that people can actually see the model. So it's really about 5 different domains. So we're looking at status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. Those are the 5 domains that are looked at. So this is David Rock's idea that those are the 5 areas of social interaction that are most likely to lead to a threat response and most likely to lead to a reward response.
Okay.
So that's what we're working with. And if we are having a threat response, his idea is that we move away from that social group. There's an away from response. And if we are having a reward response, then we will move towards the social group. So we'll become more involved because we're having those reward responses.
Because it's giving us something that we need.
Yeah. So in episode 22, I mentioned a German psychotherapist called Karen Horney who had ideas about neuroses and defence mechanisms. So she had the idea that we have 3 different defence mechanisms as humans. So a towards, So that's kind of like an appeasing, accommodating, trying to make things right, and away from, so we just move away, or an against, where we might want to argue it out and fight against it. So those are the three responses. And I think if we think about scarf and we've got that threat response, David Rock's idea is that that leads to an away from response. Now, it might be in time you move away from the group because you're having that threat response. But in the moment, it could well be that you move against the group. So you stand and argue and argue your case. Or you might do the appeasing, moving towards and go, okay, well, I really need to belong to this social group, so I'm going to try harder. I'm going to fit in more. And so that might be a response that you have. So I think I now have Scarf Plus as a model because I think it's actually really useful to think, okay, this isn't necessarily someone's moving away from the group.
And we'll share that one too.
Yeah. So, but you can understand the principle that actually, if you've got a reward response, you're going to move towards whatever it is. That's what we do when we're searching for a reward. If we're after food, we keep going until we find the food. If we've got a threat response, then it's probably going to be unhelpful to us. So we will try to avoid it.
Yeah, and obviously as humans we have that need for connection and to be part of the in-group and all of those things.
Yeah,
so.
and that's exactly what he's talking about, that it doesn't take an awful lot in any one of these domains for that equilibrium to be upset and for us to feel like, oh, well, I'm no longer as much a part of the group as I thought I was. Oh, they're now best friends and I was their best friend, and sort of playground stuff of, oh, I want to be their best friend.
So my position in the group might have changed. Yeah.
So when we look at the domains individually, if we start with status, status is about where we fit in that hierarchy of a group. And, it's not particularly helpful, I think, in modern terms to talk about hierarchy. People don't like hierarchy, but hierarchies do exist. They exist within primate groups. You have the alpha male, and then you have their kind of right-hand man, and it kind of all does. It's deeply embedded in us that there is a hierarchy. So even in quite a flat structure, there will still be people that have some status, and people who are listened to because they have some status. So it's quite. I did some work some years ago with a organisation where there was some bullying going on, and the guy that was controlling the room, controlling that group of about 20 people, had no positional status. He didn't have a title, but he definitely controlled the room. It was bizarre to witness and to talk to people about, but he was in control, so had some status. So if we think about status in a social group, and we think about where we fit in, if we are being reprimanded in front of other people by the leader of the group, so like a manager, let's say, then we will have a threat response. And probably whatever our defence mechanism is, whether that's against, towards, or away from, we will have that threat response. So it wouldn't take much for that status to be impacted. And if you think about doctors and junior doctors with a senior consultant, if they are challenged and asked something and they get it wrong and they're kind of reprimanded or belittled in that social group, that's going to produce a threat response.
Yeah.
Time and time again. It doesn't stop. So I think conventional wisdom is that if you have to have a conversation with someone about their behaviour or something that's not right or performance, whatever it is, that you do it in private. Because there's less. I mean, we're still going to have a threat response if we're being reprimanded, but or receiving feedback even. If it's constructive feedback, we will quite often have that threat response. But it doesn't take much to impact on the status. Now, on the other hand, if we're being praised in front of other people or we're being promoted, then we will have a reward response, and we will feel kindly towards the people in that group, and we'll want to belong more, and we'll try harder to belong.
Yeah.
So I think that's just one element where you can see it, and particularly if you work with people in organisations, you can see it happening. So when they come and describe their situation to you, you can, what I tend to do, I just draw that out. So I might draw a circle and put those 5 words in it. So status, autonomy, relatedness, fairness, certainty was the one I missed out. So spelling scarf. And Yeah, I would just say, okay, this is a model that comes from social neuroscience, and it looks at the domains that might be impacted for anyone when they're having some reaction in a social group. Which of these do you think is being impacted for you? Now, it might not be status, it might be something else.
Okay,
But
so
just a quick check through those 5 words, people will have something that's going on for them.
and you can coach around what's happening,
Yeah.
how they see their
Yeah.
situation. So let's find out about the other domains.
Yeah. So
You've mentioned status.
yep, the C is for certainty, and there's a lot of research around change and how people respond to change, and that people don't like change, they don't like uncertainty, don't like surprises, which I think is true up to a point, but people like the surprises they like.
And people don't always like the absolute certainty because it can become monotony.
Yeah, Tony Robbins, who's some people might be aware of, is a big brash American coach, multimillionaire. He's a bit marmitey, you know. I don't really like his style, but he's very, very successful. But he talks about the 6 needs that we have as humans, and the first one is certainty, a need for certainty. And the second one is uncertainty, because if we have complete certainty, life just becomes a bit dull and tedious. For some people, I mean, how you respond to that is going to be dependent on your personality. And some people who have perhaps a more conscientious way of being can cope with more certainty.
Yes.
Someone who's low on the conscientiousness scale and high on the openness scale in terms of personality traits will probably want a bit more uncertainty in their life.
Bit of spontaneity.
Bit of spontaneity, yeah. But it's one of those domains that if you think about organisational context and social groups, again, people like to know where they are in the social group. So if there's a degree of uncertainty going on, so let's imagine a restructure within an organisation, it creates uncertainty. People tend not to be told what's going on, so that the not knowing, the uncertainty around not knowing, can be really problematic for people and will produce a threat response. Once they know, that tends to help ease even if they know that they're going to be leaving the organisation, having the certainty that that's happening tends to help.
I'm just thinking back to the start of COVID and everything else, and I can only imagine the uncertainty in hospitals and GP practices where they obviously had to carry on there every day, but what was coming, what was looming, what can we do? What is the legislation going to be?
Yeah, and it was constantly changing, wasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, we didn't know as as citizens of the country, let alone the frontline people.
Yeah, and obviously this work is to do with the social group, really. So actually, that uncertainty created by the outside world might make you more cohesive as a group.
Yes.
So it might lead more to a reward response within the group if you're all in it together.
Yes, I hadn't thought of that.
So you've got that in-group then, haven't you?
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's us against the world, and how are we going to deal with it? That could be really helpful.
Interesting.
Yeah, so certainty is something that will come up in the coaching room, especially when change is happening. People will be having some reaction to it. They might like it. If they're going to benefit from the change that's happening, that lack of certainty in the moment might be rewarding for them.
Yeah. So what's the A?
The A is for autonomy. So this is the idea that we like to feel like we have some control over our lives and our daily activities, and we don't really like to be micromanaged, and we don't like being told what to do. And so within a social group, if we are being micromanaged, that is definitely going to produce a threat response for us. And I've definitely coached people. I've coached people who have been told that they're micromanaging, so I've helped them to understand what's going on for them in that situation. And I've coached people who feel as though they are being micromanaged. So that's definitely, you can see the threat response that comes up for people.
And I suppose there would be a reward if you were given more autonomy, given more responsibility in the workplace.
Yeah.
Or if you were having it taken away from you.
Yeah, so Daniel Pink, who's a thought leader around motivation, that's the big thing he writes about. He recognises that the 3 main motivators for us as humans are autonomy, mastery, so being good at what you do, autonomy, being left alone to get on with it, and purpose, understanding why it's important that you do what you do and it has some meaning for you. So mastery, autonomy and purpose, three big drivers for us in terms of motivation. So if we feel threatened as far as our autonomy is concerned, and we just got someone watching over us going, no, you're doing that wrong, giving us feedback all the time, then that's not helpful. And we will probably have a threat response to that. Whereas if we're given more autonomy, as long as it's not, well, you run the whole thing and we'll leave you alone to do it, and it's 10 people's work, as long as it's not that, then we will probably have a reward response to being given some autonomy.
I like this model.
Good.
Yes. Tell me about the R.
The R is for relatedness, and this is how we relate to the other people in the group. And obviously, there may be situations where we get on with most people, but there's one person we don't particularly get on with, and we'll probably avoid them a little bit or argue a lot with them, and it doesn't necessarily impact on the rest of the group, but it could easily do so. You could have a disagreement with someone and they talk to other people, and then it spreads and you become part of the out group, and there's an in-group that doesn't agree with you. So you can see that happening, and I've done some work recently with someone where they're a CEO of a charity, and the board of the charity, she feels, are quite cohesive as a board and acting against her interests, which is a really interesting dynamic, because she almost feels she can't penetrate the board to have her say and just to find a way in. So great that the board are cohesive, but their behaviour, and I don't think it's intentional, I think their behaviour is leading her to feel isolated and not related to the board.
It sounds like a lot of this is potentially perception.
It could be.
But there might be some reality in there as well.
And it doesn't take much for us to feel like we belong or we don't belong.
No.
There's a guy called Henri Tajfel who did some work in the 60s and 70s around what is required for us to feel like we belong. And it didn't take very much. He did a study with students where he split them into two groups and said, OK, you're in the Kandinsky group and you're in the Klimt's group, so two modern artists, and just told them they were in those groups. It didn't mean anything. They didn't have to do anything. And then they were given this challenge of splitting up some money, and they had to apportion money to people in the different groups. And they gave more to the people that they were told were in the whatever group they'd been assigned to. So if they were in the Kandinsky group, they actually gave more money to, even though they had nothing to do with them, they just gave them more money. So that was all it took, was just being, well, you're in that group.
Interesting.
And there was I can't remember the lady's name, but there was a lady who did some research in the 70s in America where she told pupils in her class, so this was primary school children, she told them that children with blue eyes were really good, well behaved, very clever, very intelligent, and people with brown eyes were really stupid and rude and ignorant, and kind of created that in-group, and it was all around racism and that unconscious bias that we might have. And it was just remarkable how the children took that on and went, okay, yeah, I'm blue eyes, I'm clever. And then the next day she switched it around and said, oh no, sorry, I made a mistake. Actually, the blue-eyed ones are the ones that are stupid and rude and bad. And they kind of took on that identity as well. But they then saw themselves as part of that group. So it's just, oh, well, you've got blue eyes, so you're part of that group. So we do look for those connections with people, and we will find odd little ways to connect.
Yeah, maybe a cautionary tale on labels there somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But I think the point is that we do want to connect. We want to belong, and we will look for those connections in our social group. And if we feel like we're being isolated or alienated from that group, that will have a threat response for us. And the more connection we can find with people, and whenever I do team building activities, quite often it's around, okay, well, what interests do you have and what's your background? And you can see, oh, well, I like knitting as well. Suddenly
finding
those
common
connections
ground.
are made. Yeah. So that's a
yeah.
rewarding aspect of the relatedness.
And then we come on to fairness, which is an interesting aspect.
And again, within organisations, this is going to come up time and time again, because people will have a perception of what's fair, and it might not be the same as someone else's perception of what's fair. So when I do personality work, people with a thinking preference, it's thought that people with a thinking preference tend to treat everyone. They think fairness is treating everyone equally, so treating everyone the same. That's fair. People that have a feeling preference, it's thought that they see fairness as treating everyone as individuals. So giving them what they need individually. That's fair. So different nuanced view on fairness, and that's open to interpretation, isn't it, within a social group. But people know when they feel things aren't fair.
Yes.
So it might be who gets the seat by the window. That could be what tips the balance in terms of fairness.
Yeah.
And it could be that you see someone else being treated badly, and that sense of fairness kicks in for you, and you leap to their defence. So it's not necessarily about you being treated unfairly, but people do have a sense of fairness. And again, this comes back to our evolutionary biology, that I think there's a lovely video, I can't remember, Franz de Waal, I think his name is. We'll try and put a link in the show notes, who did some work he does work with primates, and he had some monkeys that he was feeding grapes to and cucumber, and the one that gets the grapes is very happy, and the one that's fed cucumber is quite happy with cucumber until he realises the other one's getting grapes. Then suddenly is very, very upset that he's getting cucumber. So it's deeply wired in us that we want things to be fair. So again, that can tip the balance. Now, there are 5 domains. I think it only takes one domain to be impacted for someone to feel, okay, things aren't right for me. And that's probably what's going to show up in the coaching room. I don't tend to hear so much about the reward response, because people don't tend to come to coaching with things that are going well.
This is fantastic.
I've had this reward response. So we hear more about the threat response. But I think it is interesting to think about the reward response in terms of that, if people think about their future lifestyle, what they want for the future, well, how can I use that reward circuitry that we all have to make sure that I'm moving in the right direction? So I think it's something that's not really talked too much about. I mean, it's mentioned in the SCARF model, and it talks about that minimising the threat, maximising reward, but David Rock doesn't really focus too much on the reward side of things.
But it strikes me that someone as a leader within their organisation, a manager, would be served well by understanding that and maybe thinking more about how they could incorporate that into their workspace, potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. And David Rock does a lot of work in that leadership arena, so I'm sure that he would be talking about what's good practice for leaders, managers, to foster that reward response. So actually, if we think about those different domains, status is a tricky one, because if you are in some sort of hierarchy, it's difficult to manage. But I think basic good rules around not criticising someone openly in a public space is a good way not to produce that threat response, or to minimise the threat response. Actually, praising people openly, and like if someone's done good work, noticing they're doing good work and praising them, and letting other people know that they do good work. So it is possible to foster that reward response. And in terms of certainty, letting people know as quickly as possible, as much as possible. I know within organisations it's not always possible to tell everyone everything, but it's being able to do as much as you can as quick as you can, I think, is really helpful to foster that reward or head off the threat response. In terms of autonomy, giving people autonomy, there's going to be a reward response to that. So definitely doing more of that. In terms of relatedness, just doing really good teamwork activities to get people involved, get people included, so that you don't have anyone feeling alienated. That's going to produce a reward response.
And perhaps getting people included in social gatherings in different ways, because there's often a sort of a certain type of culture within certain organisations, like a Friday lunch at the pub, and that doesn't always include everyone.
Yeah,
so finding new ways
I think you're right. And
connecting.
I play tennis, and quite often people will be going for a drink afterwards, and I don't really drink, so that's not. So you're right. Within an organisation, it could be just thinking creatively about what people, and asking people what they want. We want people to be more socially involved. How do we do that? How do we include everyone?
Yeah.
And then if we think about fairness, it's going to be tricky. I don't think you can please everyone, but being clear about why you're taking the action that you're taking can help to allow people to see, and having good conversations as well, can allow people to see that you're not acting unfairly, but it might not always seem that things are fair.
And you mentioned earlier about drawing out this model. I'm trying to sort of bring together everything you said so that people can see how they might use this in the coaching room. You can draw this model out, explain the model in a little educative piece.
Yeah, bit of psychoeducation.
Yes.
Yes.
And then invite questions around, or invite the answers to questions around that model. How do you see your situation through this lens, through the lens of your status, your certainty, etc.?
Yeah, so if I can recall one coaching conversation I had where someone was not getting on with his boss. His boss didn't give him a lot of autonomy. She controlled her room. And she'd been off sick and had come back and was trying to impose her will again on someone that for 6 months had had some autonomy and been able to do what they like. So running through that list with him, his status had been impacted because while she was away, he'd kind of had to step up, not quite doing her job, but he hadn't got a manager, so his status was elevated in that time, and suddenly he was put back in his box. So that was being impacted. In terms of his sense of certainty, well, he had some certainty while she was away because he could just get on with things and he knew what was happening. Suddenly she was back and he wasn't sure how the land was lying now. How was she going to behave? And suddenly he was not allowed to do what he thought he could do for himself. So that degree of certainty had gone. In terms of autonomy, definitely that had gone out the window. He suddenly had to go through her to speak to other people outside the department. That was impacted. In terms of relatedness, he wasn't feeling particularly related to her because she was suddenly imposing things on him. And in terms of fairness, well, he'd been doing the job for 6 months. He'd stepped up and he'd held the fort for 6 months and was now just almost being punished for doing that. So that sense of fairness wasn't there as well. So I just went through that model. I just wrote those words out, put them in a circle, wrote the words out, and then said, this tends to produce a threat response if it's being impacted, or a reward response. So what is each of those producing for you? And he said, and he just went through, threat. So he could see. But what was interesting, I said to him, because his boss had been off sick. She'd had breast cancer, so been away for some time. And I said, what do you think of these domains? Which do you think is being impacted for her? And he went through the list and he said, well, status, because actually suddenly we're not quite holding her in that sort of reverence that we did before, because we've been doing the job for ourselves. And certainty, she's uncertain about her health anyway, what that means for the future, but also coming back to a team that aren't really paying her the respect they did before she went away. So that's got to be uncertain. In terms of autonomy, he didn't feel that was being impacted. In relatedness, he'd made really good connections with the others in his team, and they were almost a cohesive in-group, and she was suddenly on the outside of that, so her relatedness to them was impacted. And then sense of fairness. Well, obviously, having cancer, that's very unfair, and but also, I guess, coming back to a situation where people aren't showing her the respect she thought she wanted, she needed. She would perhaps have felt that. Now, we have no idea what she was thinking. We weren't there. She wasn't in the room. We didn't ask her. But asking him to think about her situation and what domains were being impacted for her, I think just softened his approach and made him more aware that it wasn't easy for her either. So just rather than being really combative and saying, well, I just want to fight it out, he was just much more understanding. So I think that can be really powerful.
And much of our work is about gaining new perspectives from other people's
So I think
positions.
Whilst it is about their reactions to, but it's a new understanding, isn't it?
Yes.
That if you can do that bit of psychoeducation and say, well, here's a model. It comes from social neuroscience. It's about our evolution, really, but about how we are impacted by these domains or events that happen within these domains. what do you think?
Yeah.
Then they can make sense of it for themselves. So we're not telling them which ones of theirs are being impacted and which ones of someone else's being impacted, but asking them to think about it and think in a new way, generate some new thinking about their situation. It can be really helpful, I think.
This sounds like a really useful tool to introduce.
Yeah, and I say it comes from neuroscience. He's not a neuroscientist. He's using research by neuroscientists to provide a model of social understanding that is helpful. I say I've tweaked it a bit, so I've got my Scarf Plus model. So I think there was some work still to be done.
Should tell him. Have a chat with him.
Yeah, but I think it is really useful to introduce in the coaching room.
Excellent. So there is another coaching tool for our listeners linked with our approach that we've done recently, which is the neuroscience in the previous episode. And I think this is a really interesting tool to use when the situation arises to help understand our own reactions and perhaps the reactions of others better in the workplace, maybe even in the social environment. Yeah,
I don't think it's exclusive to the workplace. I think it's just how we interact with other people, isn't it?
Life.
Yeah, life.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for taking us through the SCARF model, Tom.
You're very welcome. I've enjoyed it.
Me too, absolutely. And we are going to bring another coaching topic to the podcast next time. Things that people might bring to the coaching space. So what are we talking about next time?
Next time we're talking about the inner critic.
The inner critic. Oh, I'm sure there's lots to say and think about there.
It's going to be a good episode.
Great. Well, I am very much looking forward to that episode. For now, I will say goodbye and we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.
This has been a Monkey Pants Productions podcast.